Hello, this is Dr. Joel B. Goodin with Driven to Doctorate. Today I have the professor that I've had the longest, Dr. Denise Beike. How are you, Denise?
Oh, I'm doing great. How are you?
Good. Do you think for the point of the interview we should call you Dr. Beike or what do you prefer?
Oh, you call me Denise.
It's hard. It's hard to make that switch. And just to you said I could say this, and I'm dating myself, I'm dating you, but we met in around 97 when I began school at the University of Arkansas for my undergrad. And you had just been a professor since 95, you said, and you're a social psychologist.
Social and cognitive.
Social and cognitive. Okay.
I consider myself 51% a social psychologist and 49% a cognitive psychologist.
Okay. I don't think I knew the difference back then. Now I know somewhat. So, yeah, we met back in 97, and I think you were obviously one of the people that taught my courses, but I think if you had done a horrible, awful job, I probably wouldn't have stuck with it. So there's something to be said. I need to say thank you for leading me to finish my PhD in Ed Psych. So you're at the University of Arkansas. Tell me
By the
now.
way, you may or may not remember this, but I was on your honors thesis committee.
Right.
You did an honors thesis with Eric Knowles, yeah. And so
Right.
I'm assuming you invited me into that role, so I guess I made somewhat of a positive impression back then, if you remember that.
I remember asking you for letters of recommendation and yeah. No, I wasn't sure if you were on that committee. It's been a while, right? But you have a better memory than I do. That was a long time ago. I barely knew what I was doing, which doesn't say much for the honors thesis, but I think it was good. I got a lot of good research experience back then in undergrad, which is really rare, I think, right?
Yeah.
But you're still there. You've served in many roles. You've been the chair of the department. What are you doing right now?
What am I doing? So in terms of any supervisory roles, so I've been the chair of the department. I've been the director of graduate training in the experimental psychology PhD program several times. And I currently, I hold my puppy just came in here. You're going to hear puppy squeaky sounds.
That's good.
I currently hold a non-titled role. I train the graduate students how to teach their own courses independently. So I'm the supervisor of the grad students who are teaching.
All right. Excellent. So it's been a long time. I think, yeah, you've served in about every role. I like to always go back to the beginning. I was telling you before the interview, I don't remember where you're from. I'm not sure I ever knew, but I probably did. Where are you from? Where can you tell me? Where you grew up, something like that.
Yeah, I grew up in St. Louis.
Feel free to bring the puppy into the picture.
Yeah, definitely. You want to see the puppy? You can always edit this out later. This is Phoebe.
Hey.
Phoebe's 15 weeks old and she likes nipping and biting things. And she also cannot stand to be alone, so she invades every class and every meeting. All right, buddy, you gonna be good? You good? We'll be good. So I grew up in St. Louis, and I did my undergraduate and graduate degrees at Indiana University. And right after I finished after my last year of graduate school, I came here as a faculty member. So I did a couple of unusual things. One is that I stayed at the same place for grad school as undergrad. And the other is that I got an academic job right out of grad school and never moved from that place. That's really rare these days.
Right. So yeah, I thought you were a good fit there. So you must have been at least content with it, and they were content with you. I think I remember, well, at least the office you had when I was there. It was like way back in a corner. But yeah, so okay, so you began in St. Louis. You made your way to the U of A. No jobs really in between. Any interesting things to note along the way? Were you like prom queen or the volleyball captain? Anything? Nothing like that.
I was a marching band geek.
Sorry, say again.
I was a marching band geek.
A marching band geek. I hear that a few times. Um, Two of my other mentors have been sort of marching band geeks that have, I guess they also like led it afterward. They became like captains. They were more like in the ed field, and so I guess they were teaching K-12 and did marching band stuff. That's
It
weird.
must be a good training ground for academia. Yes.
Managing a lot of people.
Yeah.
So you've been, when we talked about this, you've been teaching from home. This is, let's see, we're in May 4th. And so we're sort of, who knows how far into the pandemic, but it's better than it was. So how has that been for you teaching? You said you've been teaching from home.
Yeah, so the University of Arkansas, we closed campus right in the crush when everybody else did, and it was like March 21st or March 17th or something like that. And we were warned 3 days earlier, hey, get ready because after spring break, we may shut the campus down. Well, spring break was like, after spring break would have been 3 weeks away. Well, it was 3 days later that was like, everybody go home. And so we had 3 days to prepare everything. So the spring of 2020 was a blur and a mess, and did my very best. I did okay. But the thing that was especially challenging for me was that as I mentioned, I supervise and train graduate student teachers, and I do a seminar in the summer, a teaching seminar where I teach students how to teach their own class. I had to teach that course remotely and had to teach the students how to teach both remotely and face-to-face, depending upon how we decided to do things in the fall. So I was simultaneously learning how to teach remotely and teach students remotely how to teach remotely, and also prepare them for possibly teaching face-to-face, which a couple of them did. It was really, it was a character building experience, shall we say. I was desperate for knowledge. I did all kinds of training workshops and programs. It was mostly tech kind of training, like here's how Blackboard works, you can do this. And our knowledge about remote teaching was virtually nil, because almost everything we knew before the pandemic was about asynchronous courses with students who wanted to take them. So here's the best way to teach asynchronously. And what we did not know is how do you teach synchronously or asynchronously, but to students who didn't want to take a class that way and they're stuck doing it, and faculty who didn't want to teach that way and are stuck doing it. It's a different population entirely of people who signed up for a class that they thought was going to be an advanced research class where they come to class and do hands-on stuff, and instead they're sitting in their dorm room or their apartment or their parents' house watching my little square face. And it is, it's challenging. There's a bunch of research that's going to come out after this, and there'll be decades worth of research to do on this phenomenon. So not only having to transition my own courses, but to meta transition and then help graduate students figure out how to work this was, I learned a lot. And I also learned how little we knew at the time and are just starting to learn now.
Right. So obviously you still had your curricula, to pull from, your knowledge set to pull from, but you were learning how to teach online while synchronously, while teaching other people how to teach online synchronously.
That's right.
So what, I mean, I teach online all the time. It's often one-on-one, it's often different, but did you learn anything, or what's maybe two tricks that you learned that were just like, oh, this really works for me? Was there anything like that?
Yeah, definitely. One of the things I learned is that you're not being as clear as you think you're being. You're not being as clear as you think you're being. When you're sitting in a room with people and you're like, okay, so here's this thing, okay, and their faces go, huh? And you're like, anybody have any questions? Mm-mm. Don't we understand? You find out when students have to really do a lot of stuff on their own that you're not really being that clear, and particularly in terms of instructions and in terms of text. So when I would say in the past, do quiz one, it's on Blackboard. That was my instructions. Do quiz one, it's on Blackboard. Well, if you set up a course on Blackboard and I set up a course on Blackboard, we're going to put the quizzes in very different places, potentially. Right. And there may not be the right kind of breadcrumbs and threads to get there. And so what I'm asking my students to do is figure out how to read my mind about my online course setup and figure it out. And then if they send me an email, I'm like kind of cranky and I have to write 3 drafts of it before I get to the one that says, click over here and then do this. Why didn't I do that in the first place? Why didn't I give them the right instructions in the first place and say, here's how you find quiz one? And by the way, before you get started, here's the instructions for quiz one. Maybe we should do a sample quiz so you can all find the quizzes and know how they work and understand how, it's all set up. Like all of that stuff is this time-wasting crap that previously I just assumed students should take care of. And I became sensitive to the fact that you're really wasting your students' time they should be spending on their education by not making everything accessible and clear and transparent. My instructions for how to do an assignment used to be like, answer these questions. And I had to get to the point, because I was getting so many more questions remotely, like, oh, well, this isn't, if you're not looking at my face, suddenly it's not clear what you're supposed to do. I don't know why. So I need to be really clear about how everything needs to go. And so I kind of did this thing, which I also saw as advice: put yourself in the mind of a student and retake your class. Mm. And think about what you're asking students to do, what the requirements are. Do they know where to find everything? Is it clear? If you need them to access information they've already been exposed to, which information? Save them some time. Say, by the way, some of the information you'll need for this was covered in class on April 24th. And here's where that information is. Like, yes, we all need to find information and get good at that, but that wasn't really what the point of my courses was to try to dig through this really elaborate structure of stuff on an LMS. So that's my advice. You're not being as clear as you think you're being. Try to strip away all expectations and try to look at your syllabus anew. Try to look at your assignments anew. Try to look at your course structure anew, and think about how you can make it clearer, because you can. And you're going to save students time. You're going to save them frustration. And you might just save a student from failing or withdrawing from your course because they're just kind of struggling with stuff that they don't need to be struggling with. So it's kind of like how Piaget's tests are criticized for being too hard to test the actual cognitive thing that he wanted to test, right? So a lot of us are structuring our courses and our instructions in ways that we're making students do tasks that aren't essential to the learning. Right. And so find what's essential to the learning and do that. And then if there's excessive stuff around that, explain it, show it, get people to where they need to be to demonstrate their knowledge.
Right. Oh, I think that's fantastic. Was there anything that you sort of, any aha moments or just things you noticed that you're saying that maybe you think, well, when I get back in the face-to-face classroom, I'm going to remember this, because this is something I learned about teaching that I think applies back to the face-to-face encounter. Is there anything like that?
Yeah, I'm going to be more deliberate and intentional about asking questions. So one way to make online classes, synchronous online classes at all involving, or to do things like polls throughout the class, right? So, okay, which of these movies have you seen? Or, here's something we covered last time. What's the right answer? To just get people involved. And so you have to set that up in advance when you're doing a remote class or an asynchronous class. You kind of do that more on the fly when you're teaching face to face. You're like, oh, well, let me stop for a minute. So, okay, so let's make sure you all got this. So if this happened, would it be this or this? And then you have a conversation. I need to be more deliberate about that, not just spontaneously waiting for those moments to emerge. Have polls, have questions, ask them, see what happens. The other thing I want to figure out how to transition, my favorite thing about remote teaching has been the chat.
Mm-hmm.
I love the chat. I love that I'm talking about this over here and I'm presenting this and there's questions popping up and students are talking to each other in the chat. I think that's great. I love it. It was distracting for the first 2 days and then I just loved it. So on several levels, students were processing information and shy students just shoot a question in the chat instead of raising their hand or interrupting. I watched entire things happen in the chat where students taught things to each other. And I don't know how to make that happen in the classroom, but I'm determined to figure it out. We just have everyone, have their cell phones and be able to throw chat questions out somehow. I don't know. Do you have any ideas about that?
I think there's an option for that. Yeah, we could talk about that more, but I think a merged reality sort of situation where they have like a tablet or a phone, and then you have obviously, so you're still almost operating sort of virtually, but they have that sort of chat feature available, and you can check it just like you would in a synchronous virtual presentation. And you can look down and see if they're chatting with each other. You're good.
Sorry, I'm not walking the puppy.
But that's interesting because obviously you're what you said 49% or 51 cognitive, and so obviously normally the auditory that information, the talking in the back of the class or whatever between students would be more of a distraction. It would obstruct your teaching to them. But due to the chat feature, it may distract them a little bit, but it also adds the ability for them to sort of hash it out in a sidebar situation. And so I think that's really interesting to bring that into a face-to-face potential. Especially if you can, obviously not have the whispering, which is distracting to the teacher. But if it's a chat, it's silent for the most part. And then you just have to remember, obviously, let me check the chat. Let me see if anybody's asking something or if there's an interesting conversation. That's really insightful. I like that. So I didn't mean to spend too much time on that, and if you have any follow-up on that, I might be able to help. Because I do obviously a lot of online. Everything I do is online.
The other dog, sorry.
Oh, you're good. So we sort of talked about how did you get to where you are now, and what do you do? Is there anything more to say about what you do now? You're teaching these courses. What else are you doing?
Oh, well, so I'm, a tenured faculty member. So my breakdown is 40-40-20. So 40% teaching, 40% research, and 20% service. So I spend as much time on research as I do on teaching, or I should. Teaching has sucked up more time than having to transition to remote and figure that out. It's taking way more time. But still doing research. So I do research primarily on autobiographical memory for life events. And I'm interested in the effects of autobiographical remembering on people. So I care not so much about what you remember and how well you remember it. I'm interested in what happens once you remember something. So there is evidence, including evidence that I have published about autobiographical memories playing a role in relationship formation and maintenance when we share memories with each other, in motivation and directing behavior, deciding what to do, getting the motivation behind moving forward with something. And right now I'm wrapped up in the role of autobiographical memory and identity, which is a quagmire I won't descend into, except to say that there's some link between memory of life events and how we think of ourselves. So that's my primary research. And then I also do research on emotions, regret and hate and missing someone are the three that I am researching at the moment. I don't know why those three, but that's just what happened.
Oh, that's interesting.
And then a bunch of, what was that?
That's interesting.
Yeah, I'm not saying they're related to each other or anything, but yeah, they're related, and then I'm interested in all three. And then my graduate students have all kinds of interests. I tend to, we'll come back to this, I'm sure. I tend to work with my graduate students in a way that I generally encourage them to explore their interests rather than for them to just take my studies and do them for me.
So hate and missing someone and identity based on memory. Are you familiar with Ladke's work on narrative implotment? Just curious.
That sounds really familiar.
He's sort of I guess the basic idea is sort of if you are able to sort of weave like maybe a traumatic event or just an occurrence into the narrative of your story and sort of make it fit, provide that meaning of like, here's how this fits into my life story or into this period of time by integrating it. There's some sort of some level of resolution, which potentially leads to more well-being. And if you're until you're able to find the purpose of X in your story, I think he might posit that, like then you're sort of stuck. You have this feeling of stuckness. That's a word I used. Word I learned, in grad school. Probably in your class, stuckness. But we are using some new words like grit and some words that just become sort of words like, grit is like on the tops of books now.
Yeah, I do want to say though about the basic theoretical notion that trauma needs to be woven into your life story. There's a caveat to that I think is really important. There's some research on the idea of a trauma being central to your self-definition. There's a measure called the centrality of event to self scale, the CES. And what has been found with that is that people who are trauma survivors, if they see that trauma as central to their identity, they integrate it really well into their identity, they're very poorly off. You are better seeing the trauma as some side thing, side quest you went on. I mean, that's not to say that you can't incorporate it into your life story, but if your life is about how everything led to this trauma and, leads out of that, that's actually unhealthy. And it's better off if you can see it as something that's not central to who you are.
I'll say this with hopefully some delicacy, but and you're welcome to sort of be very vague in your response, but that would, in my mind, lead to sort of some implications for living in victimhood. Does that make sense? That connection there? And
I think that's the kind of the motivation behind that. That sort of it was thinking of. So the critique. This is not my research, by the way. So we can select it and burn it if you want. But the notion that led to the development of this measure was that there seems to be this therapeutic notion that trauma survivors need to embrace that identity, right?
Right.
And so this is a pushback against that says don't embrace that as an identity. You don't have to be in denial about it, but there's a middle road. I think that's kind of how I would put all this together. There's a middle path of acceptance where this happened, right? And you can weave it into your life story. You can see a purpose of it, but that can't be here. It's got to be over here in the periphery for the best healing. I'm sure that there's a way of putting it totally behind you and denying it ever happened. That's probably bad also. But that you shouldn't make it central. And yes, I think that the notion there is that might make you a person who's more living in victimhood if you see the trauma as central to your identity.
Right.
Yeah.
I think it should probably be something that happened something that happened that you don't need to ignore or deny, but it's not who you are. It's sort of like the mistakes you've made, big or small in life, are not who you are. In a similar way, obviously, one was your responsibility. Traumas typically are not. They can be your responsibility as well. Anyway, that's really.
Well, see, this is why, you know, again, you can delete, you can remove all this from the video that you put together, but just for clarification about the kind of research I'm doing on autobiographical memory and identity, this whole notion is important to me because there are theories that say that autobiographical memory feeds into your identity. So the stuff that happens to you is part of how you define yourself. And the studies that test that are, in my opinion, not particularly well done. And they ignore this, they sideline the fact that, like what you just said, stuff that happens to you isn't necessarily you. When you ask people what their most important life events are, they'll tell you usually things like really culturally scripted stuff, like I graduated high school, and then I went to college, and then I graduated, and then I got married, and then I had my kids. And they'll tell you traumas as really important autobiographical memories. But those aren't particularly self-defining. The fact that I graduated high school is not like this thing about who I am, right? Who I am is the people I love and my hobbies and my goals and my pets. You know, that's who I am, my personality characteristics. I am a high school graduate and I can remember high school graduation is not my identity. So I think this bears upon the notion of trauma, that just because something's important and happened to you doesn't mean it's who you are. And I think it's healthy and right to allow those to be independent. They can relate, but they don't have to relate. And I think that's, so I sort of think that the notion that autobiographical memory gives us our identity is naive.
All right, so I'll make one more point / question about it. You were mentioning all the research. I think a lot of us, I don't know how you've been during COVID, but it's more been like even the researchers are surviving to some extent. I don't know how many of us have seized upon the opportunity, so to speak, of like, oh, I'm gonna do it. People don't really even seem to want to fill out surveys or respond to interviews or whatever it may be during COVID. A lot of that is based on what my students have endured. That's slowed down a lot. People have isolated a lot. Anyway, I don't know if your perception of that is similar, but in terms of getting at, you said there's sort of a trove of research now about what it's been like during the pandemic. Do you think autobiographically that we'll be able to capture a lot of that?
Yeah. Oh gosh, I have so many thoughts about this, so I want to edit them down. I think, oh God, okay. So I think that we're going to have an interesting and unique set of memories about this time. For one thing, it is a time in everyone's life that we all experience the same thing at the same time, and that almost never happens. It happens, you know, like that happened to Americans who were alive, people in the U.S. who were alive during the 9/11 attacks, right? But even then, we didn't all live in cities that were directly involved. So this is something where everyone in the world experiences. Every single nation has had some kind of lockdown or other, has certainly had, you know, mass illness and death, right? And these are all similar memories. And so we're having this moment of autobiographical memory where our memories are not idiosyncratic. They're actually the same as others. That seems like it could provide lots of opportunities for sharing, or maybe not. Why do we need to talk about it? Why do you and I need to talk about how it was when we, you know, when we suddenly everything closed down and then we had to do things online? Like, are we going to keep talking about that over the years? Or are we going to just kind of say, oh yeah, right, we know that, that thing that happened. The other thing about autobiographical memory that I feel compelled to say is that there's research on time perception. Stick with me, this is relevant. I promise I'll bring it back. So there's research on time perception that shows that, and memory, that shows that people perceive time as, in retrospect, as extended to the extent that a lot of stuff happens. So when I have a year that's full of events, right? That year in my memory seems like it's a lengthy period of time. When I have a year where nothing much happened, it feels short. So I have this feeling that we're all going to look back on the pandemic time as a kind of a really foreshortened period of time because not much happened. A lot of crap happened, but it was just terrible, the same terrible shit day after day. And then, when you look back on it, there's not these unique events that allow you to say, oh yeah, that was the year I got married and I bought a house and I broke my leg and I got a puppy, right? So when all those things happen in a year, the year feels long. When the same stuff or nothing really, which a lot of us experience a lot of nothing, happens, it feels like that time wasn't very long. We may all just sort of push aside and not have many autobiographical memories about the year plus of the pandemic. I'm interested in this, and for me, this is a source of more data than usual. So you're saying that, your students have said, I can't get people to participate, or the way they're doing everything is different. And I'm like, yeah, and I'm going to have a big bunch of juicy data to dive into as a result of that.
Well, I'd love to hear more about that. So I'll try to stay in touch. That's it's really interesting. I guess my experience with time perspective has been future time perspective. You're doing retrospective. So, but I bet a lot of the same, it's probably the same constructs for the most part, like speed, extension, duration, things like that. Okay. Awesome. No, actually, you said, I can cut this, but actually, no, I love for people to get into their thing, their things and the caveats and because I think that's where the conversation gets interesting. And it's not just this formulaic interview. And they also hear about a potential line of research that they could look into, they could follow it, they could do something in that. They could reach out to you at dbeike@uark.edu, right? DBEIKE @uark.edu. Sorry, what were you saying?
Right. I was going to say there's another point to this too, which is this is what happens when research geeks talk to each other, right? And so if you are considering graduate school, if you're a person watching this and you're considering graduate school, if this looks fun, then you're set for grad school. If this looks like not the way you want to spend your time, you see me getting all animated as I talk about, but then there's time perspective, right? That is my life, and that's the fun part of my life and my job. And so the fact that we got into this whole conversation, that's what graduate school is like. You have a lot of these conversations all the time, and you already know whether you like this or not. If you don't like these kinds of in-depth conversations about detailed research things, you'll struggle in graduate school. You might succeed tremendously, but you won't have that same hedonic experience of, that a lot of others will have, and it'll be a little bit more difficult for you. And so you get used to the fact that people around you are geeking out about research topics. They go out for happy hour or dinner and they keep talking about it. That's what happens. And to me, that's a beautiful, wonderful part of the experience. For other people, they don't really like that, and they would just like to be able to switch it off. So be prepared that this is the environment that, you will be in graduate.
Mm-hmm. I would say that probably those people that are not that don't enjoy this have turned this off by now. They've turned off the interview. They've self-selected out. They've opted out. But if you're still listening and you don't enjoy at least the dynamic that you're hearing, not necessarily the subject matter, but the dynamic of this, like where we're both excited. I don't even study what Denise studies, but it still fascinates me, and I'd love to be involved. And that's sort of how I feel about every research. I'm like, oh, I want to get into that. And if you don't sort of get a good sort of feeling of rush, a hedonic experience is what I think you said, out of sort of seeing that dynamic play out, people thinking, if then maybe you need to be in, no offense to your husband, but maybe they need to be an engineer or something, right? Something that is more practical, hands-on, or of course
Well,
that
my
includes
husband has these
grad school too,
conversations
though.
too. My
Right.
husband has these conversations with his coworkers. They're just about wafers and semiconductors and stuff. So
Right.
they also get excited about that, right? Yeah.
Yeah, that was a poor example, but I was trying to think of something more practical. Um, whereas we often do sort of live in the theoretical and the what ifs and okay, so you started to talk about what I wanted to talk about next is which is grad school, but you talked about you were going to sort of share with us your thoughts on sort of the relationship with a chair or mentor. What do you have to share about that?
Okay, so as you reminded me, Joel, there are different types of programs that have different types of ways that you get paired with your faculty mentor, or the chair of your thesis or dissertation, or your advisor, sometimes they're called. But it's different from an undergrad, right? So an undergrad, you've got one person who's advising 100 or 600 or 1,000 students about their curriculum. The nature of that relationship is different in graduate school. We have someone who's mentoring or directing your research process. And if you are in a clinical or counseling program, probably even a different person will be mentoring or directing your clinical training process. But that's much more hands-on and one-on-one, and it's no matter how you end up paired with a person, it's a different relationship than most relationships in life, I would say. So I would want students to be prepared as they enter graduate school that your research supervisor, mentor person, whatever you call them, I describe this relationship as part boss, employee, part parent-child, and part best friend. And it varies from moment to moment. So when I work with my graduate students, from time to time, I will say to that student, yeah, get this done. Or like, yeah, this wasn't very good, fix that. That's like sort of the boss thing. There's also a parental role for me where I'm concerned for them, and I want to maximize their benefit and think about their future. And they talk to me about problems and issues, even if they don't want to. Sometimes they need to let me know what's going on so I can be the best mentor for them. And I take pride in their successes, like a parent would. And then some chunk of the time, we're best friends. We're doing what you and I just did. We're like, oh, the data, and we're really excited about that. And we think about where should we go next? What should we do? Where should we publish it? And what do we do? And and it's just fun to talk about all of these things. And so but it moves from time to time. And so you need to be prepared that relationship is not just you walking in and the person saying, here's your list of things to do, and then I'll grade you on each of them. It's much more fluid, and the roles shift a lot, and you just need to be prepared for that. And most, I think, entering graduate students are fairly well prepared for that, but some are surprised by that. And the students I've had the most difficult time with were the ones that wanted me to be a boss all the time. And that's not be a boss, but be their boss all the time. And that's not how it works. Not for most people. There are exceptions. The other consequence of this is that you need to know as a student, when you meet with your supervisor, mentor, chair, whatever, you're the student is the one who has the agenda for that meeting. You decide what you need to talk about. Don't expect that every meeting you have with your supervisor, advisor is them telling you what to do, and certainly not telling you what to do that week or that day. You need to make sure that you ask them, okay, so I know the next thing I need to do is fill out an IRB form. I did this much of it, but now I'm not sure what to do. Or, who do I contact about this? Or can you help me look at this data set? You need to be much more directive than you're used to being as an undergraduate, and maybe even than you're used to being in your first year or two of grad school. You get more and more to be the person directive in that. That's what I wanted to say about that.
That's part of the progression of being a PhD, right? Where you're taking more and more of the competent role. You're becoming more of an authority on the process and the content. Yeah, And yeah, it's helpful with it when a student does have that. Here are the questions I have. Here's what because I don't know how many. I'm curious because I'm not sure I ever knew. How many students do you chair like at once? Can it?
So
At,
right now I have three. Three is typical for me,
Okay.
who
Okay.
are entirely, most are mine. I'm on the committees of, lots of undergraduate students, and then I have undergraduate honor students that I chair as well. But I usually have three grad students in my lab.
Okay. Yeah. But you're doing so many other things. You're teaching courses. You're doing X, Y, and Z. And so when a student comes in for a meeting about their dissertation, it's sort of like, I always tell them, I need you to orient me, reorient me to your study, to what's going on right now, to what questions you need to ask. You need to catch me up. You need to focus me. If you don't want to, that's fine, but we're going to waste 15 minutes for me to figure it out. So yeah, and the role thing you mentioned of there are sort of these three different people that the dissertation chair or mentor is. Normally that's not a good thing in life to be three different people to somebody, and to flip those roles back and forth, even within a single conversation. This is something I work on in therapy, sort of my personal life. It's a personal life issue with like, don't switch between being this way, being friend, and then being boss, then being, those are normally that's not a good setup. So I'm thinking about that as you said it. And it is sort of, it would be a struggle, sort of a jarring, surprising, but a really confusing experience, I think, for students. Because, 1 second we are talking as friends. Ooh, and this will be great. And then, okay, now you need to do this, and this. And it's a lot of role switching. And for the person on the other end of that, it's who am I talking to, right? Like there's a lot of that.
Sometimes I will actually just declare these things explicitly, like, okay, right. I'm now going to have to talk to you as your boss. This is not going to cut it, and this is not, whatever. Or I'll say, the friend thing is easy to slip into. You don't have to announce that, right? You're just like, hey, we're clearly having a good time. Maybe we'll get lunch, whatever. Like, that's pretty clear. But I sometimes have to declare that I'm switching to boss or switching to parent and saying, here's where I switch to parent. I'm really concerned about you. And what I want more than anything else is for you to be well and to be good. And I want you to be happy. And you can tell me now that you want to work with somebody else, or you can tell me what I'm here for you, and we're going to do that for a while. And don't worry what it means about our other professional relationship or our friendship. Right now, I'm here for you. And I'm going to fight for you, with the other members of the department to make sure that we get you through this thing. So I find that sometimes it helps to declare those things. So I tell students explicitly from day one that we're going to have these three roles and they're going to switch around. And they always say, oh, yeah, that's fine. And they encounter it and they're like, okay, that was weird. So I find that sometimes is useful to acknowledge it.
No, I think that's good, and sort of say, all right, now I'm going to be your boss. I'm going to switch hats, so to speak. That's really interesting. See, I learn a lot in these interviews. So it's for me, I get research ideas, and part of what I've done, I'll just share this with you because we haven't talked about in a while. But like doing this, and I carry a larger load. I think we have 2 graduations a year, and I think I'm on the committee of 15, 16 that are about to graduate this month, I think. And so I'm always doing this, and I've decided like, oh, I want to study this because I'm ed psych, so it's an educational process with 50% attrition, generally, right? We have 50% success rates. And so like, I want to study this. This is a performance endeavor, right? Where we as the chair can truly be, sort of a make or break factor. If we do a poor job, it's likely the student will have significant problems. If we do a good job, the student may or may not succeed, but at least we're doing our job. So this is something I really have started like studying, and got a study about to go into IRB right now.
I think it's really important. And one other thing I'm going to interrupt you, I'm sorry, just to say, is that I believe, and so these are anecdata, that there isn't one right way to be the chair, the mentor. That really part of this magic, I think, is understanding those triple roles and then trying to match them to students' needs. So different students of mine have needed different things. There are some who really just worked the best when we were friends and spent a lot of time talking about random stuff and music, and went to, see shows and, whatever, would have a happy hour. And there are others that worked best when it was very formalized and I was only a boss and that was it. And I would try, sometimes I can have conversations with students and ask them, what do you prefer? But oftentimes I discover that there are some who really just respond to one of those roles more than others, or they need a real balance across that. And I hate any kind of research that involves, well, it's different for everybody, right? But I think that's part of why this is such a difficult role, is that students may need different things, and the same student may need different things at different times. And being sensitive to all that, especially when you have 15 such students under your care, is an incredibly difficult cognitive and emotional task, and time task.
It is. I love it. But yeah. And I think maybe I'm built for it, honestly. Like I'll share this with you. Like, the interview is not about me, but I'll share quickly. Like I started out wanting to counsel, do therapy, things like that. Actually, I didn't even declare my major until like the 4th year of undergrad, but eventually I did. And then I went to grad school and got a master's in counseling, and then a PhD in ed psych, for what reason I'm not exactly sure. But it's sort of like, now I've got this counseling background with this good research foundation, theoretical foundations, performance sort of emphasis, stress, emotion, motivation. And so that, like and I study expertise. I'm into Anders Ericsson stuff, deliberate practice theory, stuff like that. And so studying the doctoral student is just fascinating to me. And always, obviously, it's also a personal endeavor of like, how can I be the best at my job? How can I get better constantly? So that's what I'm doing. And that's the reason I'm doing these interviews. I'm not sure I was real clear about that, but that's sort of that's the motivation behind it all. I want to share behind the curtain with anybody that's watching. Here's how we think about all this, and here's some nuggets of wisdom maybe, but that's the motivation behind it. I dig this stuff. So
basically you're focus grouping at the moment. You're kind of like trying to, like, this is a one-on-one focus group almost. You're getting ideas about, you're getting information about how people operate in the real world, and then you can think about how you turn that into empirically researchable questions.
Yeah, I mean, it does serve. That's not, that's not the hidden agenda or anything, but it is a benefit, right? Because that triple role thing that you've mentioned, I'm like, well, I wonder if anybody has written about that. And if they haven't, then I could do that, right? And students could understand that. And that would not only be great for, a line on my CV or multiple lines, that could be helpful for students to understand in one of those thousands of books that's written for how to write a dissertation. That should be in there maybe, right? So
Yeah.
if it's not in there, somebody like me could put it in there. And then I'll have to give you credit, of course.
Just, give me a footnote or whatever.
A footnote.
That's all right. Yeah, I mean, I think I made that up, but I'm sure I think I made a lot of things up. But it does speak to this. There's an unusual nature of the relationship with what you're calling the chair of your dissertation, let's say. It's an unusual relationship. And so not everyone comes born knowing about that, right? It's one of many, many implicit pieces of knowledge that help people succeed in graduate school or not. And in terms of the dissertation, man, the best advice I have for you about the dissertation is don't give up. Don't give up. And never, ever be afraid to write a shitty draft of anything.
Right.
Everything starts in a shitty draft. And so, so I hear this question a lot, and it's so strange when you talk to people who are not in academia about doing a dissertation, the first question they always ask is, how long does that have to be? And I just think that's it's a funny question, right, to you and me. So I get it. I get why people ask that question, kind of, but it's really funny because that's not about producing a certain number of words or pages. It's about producing a body of work that fulfills certain criteria, blah, blah, blah. In order to do that, you have to write a certain number of words and pages. And sometimes that writing process is really where things hit a snag. Mm-hmm. And so keep going, keep writing, even if it's terrible. The great thing is we aren't chiseling things into stone. We're not writing in cuneiform in a clay tablet and you can't go back and change it. We're not even using carbon paper in a typewriter. You just you type a paragraph and it's in a Word doc and then it sucks and then you fix it. Yeah. So don't get too hung up about the writing. Just keep writing and keep writing bad stuff. And eventually you'll produce things that can be modified and you will modify them and make a thing happen. Take it one step at a time and understand that a lot of what you produce is going to be garbage.
So that's another thing that's happened since, in 97, I think I don't know if you remember it, but I had a little Mac laptop. I don't use Macs anymore, but my dad got me a little Mac laptop. I don't know if I had it in 97, but it was around that time. The internet had just sort of planted roots, and what has changed, what I'm trying to get back to is you have the power to edit like never before. Whereas before it was like, do you want to retype that whole thing? Now you can go in and pick out words and change them, and they're in a fluid document that can change a lot easier. We use track changes. We have all these tools to write a paper, an editorial process that's better than ever before. But I think your point was get something on paper. Was that sort of a lot of?
Yes, and don't be protective about it. So you will never get through the dissertation if my students do this to me, it makes me angry, that they'll say, well, I didn't want to show it to you yet because it wasn't very good. And I'm like, no, that's exactly the time to show it to me. Let me see what you've produced and I can, give you a couple of, hints or I'll just read it and you'll have done something and handed it to me. But don't be a perfectionist about getting the words on paper, right? And don't be a perfectionist about showing it to your dissertation chair. Let them see, especially if you've hit a snag, especially if you're like, I'm just spinning my wheels here. I'm trying and I can't get this section done. Show them what you've done. And often in a 12-minute conversation with me, I can help a student see something that'll allow them to work for another several weeks and get a bunch of stuff done rather than them sitting and frittering about it for weeks and weeks and weeks. Right? So write shitty drafts, show shitty drafts to people and get feedback on them. That's among my top pieces of advice about getting through it.
Write shitty drafts. You need a book that's called Write Shitty Drafts.
There's a well-known chapter by a fiction writer named, I think it's Anne Lamott, and it's called something like The Shitty Draft. And so I show this to students in my undergraduate classes. It's a really brief little piece, little essay that says that that's how she writes everything. She doesn't know how people write beautiful things. She always starts with what she calls a shitty draft. And, and if you, even if you're not a person who uses scatological terms, think about it that way in your head. I'm producing shit right now, but I'm producing something. It reduces your perfectionism and it gets you going. And you just need to put words in your document, put them in there. Don't worry, you'll fix them later. They're placeholders, they can be changed. Everything can be improved. You don't take a piece of clay and then just go, well, here's the pieta. You get a little bit, you actually start with a little bottle, right? And then you figure out, and then chip away a little here, and then eventually, you put the details in. Writing is the same way. Start with throwing a lump of clay in there, and then you can work on it. And then ask for help when the lumps of clay are not moving around the way you want them to.
Yeah. Sometimes it's draw me a picture, draw me a flow chart, draw me.
Yep.
Yeah. I do have students that just, I call them like scavengers, like, or I'm not thinking of the right word, but, they will just circle, like flying above. And I'm like, I want you to pounce on that, whatever, roadkill. I want you to dive into this. And maybe that's a conversation I can have with those, those birds that are just circling. And I'm like, okay, how long are you going to look at it before you go down and eat it, so to speak? How long until you get all this on paper? And I don't know what all is going on there. Sometimes it is sort of a thinking process. There's something to be said for that, but sometimes put those thoughts on paper. If they're not good, we can take them out. So I appreciate your insight. So
that's also advice for you and me, by the way, my friend. That is advice for you and me too about our writing projects. Just write. And I'm one of these people who, like everybody, it's a lot easier to give the advice than to take it. So I should listen to myself. Or when I'm in the mode that I'm like, yeah, I got to just write stuff and fix it later, and I get into a daily writing habit, it goes great. When I get away from it for a month or 2 or 6 or 9 months, and then I try to get back into writing something, my standards have just gotten so high, and I just feel like I can't even get started. Just write, just keep going.
That's good. That's good stuff. If anybody, faculty, student, wants to get a hold, stay in touch, somehow follow Dr. Beike, it's Beike, DBEIKE at uark.edu. There were no books or anything that you wanted to push, but you can always let me know and I'll tell people about them. Thank you so much, Dr. Beike, Denise. I get to call her Denise now that she's not my professor anymore, but especially now that I've earned my PhD. So that's one of the beautiful things. And thank you so much. This has been Driven to Doctorate with Dr. Joel B. Goodin with guest Dr. Denise Beike.